Welcome to the Arkansas Moderati podcast. Here we go.
Flying solo today as the other geniuses who usually co-pilot this podcast with me are unplugged from the matrix cables they jack into at the back of their skulls to make this show today and are out racing their Italian sports cars or gambling in Monte Carlo or whatever they do when they aren't saving the world. So I want to start today with a few more words about Moms for Liberty, or as I like to call them, the Karen Militia. Jacob Oliva, Unterführer of Education, is off to address the waiting crowds of boot clickers and gonna spend some time roasting wiener schnitzels over an open flame coming from burning celebrated literature this week at the Moms for Liberty rally. For those of you who have already forgotten because the news cycle moves so fast in this world, Moms for Liberty made news this week when one of their local chapters quoted Hitler in their newsletter, which I'm not here to give anybody advice, but maybe avoid the temptation to quote Adolf Hitler ever. Just make it part of your institutional agreement that you're not going to do it. Mostly because the brown blouses should not be reminding us that they're so similar to fascist organizations. They tell us that they're not really book banners or censors because they only want to ban books from schools, that you can still collect the books that they're banning and burning at your local bookstore or download them on your iPhone or whatever. But I think probably the Nazis could have made that claim too. They were only burning the books that were available to them locally, that you could still travel across the globe somewhere and find another copy of Jack London. But while they're making that claim, the legislators, especially look at Arkansas with the library bill that we've got here, the legislators are picking up the slack and saying that they'll go out and ban the books from the libraries that the Moms for Liberty are not chasing. When it's such a coordinated effort, I'm not sure that the claim that you're only banning books from schools makes much sense. You can't get your wife arrested and sent to prison and then congratulate yourself that she doesn't cheat on you. Liberty isn't about bulldozing the world in front of your children to make sure they never come into contact with thoughts or ideas that tempt them to ignore the morals that you teach them at home. Liberty doesn't have any meaning without choices. And so when you go into schools and eliminate the opportunity for kids to read about LGBTQ issues or civil rights or any of the things that these people want eradicated from schools, you're not supporting liberty. It's the opposite of that. Your kids don't need books to find out that civil rights or LGBTQ are things. They either already know or they're going to know in spite of your efforts to make those realities invisible. If just being in control of everything that your kids see and hear worked, Josh Duggar would not be in prison today. And now a little bit of advice for the radical left in Arkansas. First of all, in spite of the repeated use of the phrase by Sarah from Mar-a-Lago and her underlings, there are no radical leftists in Arkansas. I think I saw some polling the other day that broke down the political leanings of Arkansans, and it was something like 50% identified as Republican, 40% identified as moderates, and then the remaining 10-ish% identified as Democrats. This reflexive need to just define any criticism as the radical left at work just is so phony and pointless name-calling. And every time they do it, the fact that there's not just an uproar from literally everyone saying, just stop saying that. The propaganda is not working. Just makes my blood boil. So it irritates me that there's not any pushback about this. Consider this a little bit of a push. And I think the members of our state legislature that are Democrats should probably invest a little bit of time pointing out how ridiculous this radical left smear that Sarah continues to use is just pointless. And as long as we're on the topic of advice, I think a little bit of advice for not only the Democratic members of the Arkansas legislature, just nationwide. I understand why President Biden and the White House shouldn't talk about the indictments and all of Trump's legal problems. But there's no explanation as to why the Democratic machinery at large, other than the White House, has not spent more time talking about Trump's legal trouble. Talk about the indictments. Talk about the Eugene Carroll case. Talk about his need to constantly make confessions about what he's being accused of. The man spends every day just softballing material for you to go after him with. And the sound of the crickets coming from you people is deafening. Just, you should be hammering this guy on this stuff every single day. Caesar has walked into the Senate bleeding, and one of you should step up and be Brutus. The DOJ's note that says that you can't prosecute a sitting president for crimes that he commits while he's in the Oval Office or is still the president doesn't make any sense to me, because what if one day the president just decided to start, as Trump suggested, shooting people? He's shooting people and shooting people, and we're still, we can't really charge him with a crime while he's president. We'll wait until he's not president anymore. And then the day before he leaves office, he just pardons himself, which apparently there's some suggestion could be a thing. And I understand that the way to defeat that is supposed to be impeachment, but I don't think we took into account that so many people would be complicit in enabling the President of the United States to commit crimes. Traditional conservatism is about the rule of law, and the rule of law should apply to literally everyone equally. You shouldn't get a pass because you're running for president. You shouldn't get a pass because you are the president. And you shouldn't get a pass because you're no longer the president. If any of that made sense, every attorney in America that has a client that's on death row should advise their client to announce their run for presidency, to shield them from the death penalty. Because apparently, if you're running for president, you're immune from all criminal prosecution. Does that make any sense? In fact, Asa Hutchinson went to the GOP and said, hey, we want a clarification that if this guy is convicted of a crime, we don't have to support him in the primary. And the GOP said, no, we're not going to give that to you. So even if he's convicted of a crime, the rest of the candidates have to take a loyalty pledge to support him in a general election. What kind of law and order party requires the other candidates to support a candidate that's been convicted of multiple felonies? And what kind of a political system doesn't see this happening and rush to the floor of the House and the Senate to introduce legislation to prevent convicted felons from not only running for president, but taking the office of the presidency, after which they just pardon themselves? What says law and order about a political system that doesn't prevent felons from becoming the leader of the free world? And how important does it seem to the people entrusted with preserving this republic that they haven't rushed to do that before now? Because if you want moderates to support you, you're going to have to tell them at some point that you're not okay with all this law breaking. I don't know how many times I've heard people tell me that there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats, really. I think it's an indefensible claim. But this is a place where if you're not going to point out the difference, then why shouldn't people continue to be able to say that? Go out and tell people that you're not all right with this lawlessness, that this man breaking laws is not acceptable to you. And I promise you, there are moderates out there waiting to hear this message. People that voted for Trump or reflexively vote conservative all this time that are waiting for you to describe something better and more decent and more in line with the traditional conservative values around the need for law and order. And again, if you're okay with the president being the biggest criminal in the country, why shouldn't they be? And stop saying that just voting is the answer for everything. I understand what you're saying, but it's really such a lazy way to approach the problem. If you really think that voting is the answer, you should work harder to describe a world that moderate voters enjoy the idea of living in. Spend a little time learning to be a storyteller, and stop pretending that you don't have any responsibility to inspire swing voters to support you, especially when legislatures all over America are taking such steps to try to create rules where they can overturn the outcomes of elections at will. Moderate conservative voters ignore the sound of Trump confessing to breaking the law on tape over and over again in his own voice because they haven't realized that Trump brings chaos, not order. He brings chaos to everything. If you want to win elections and save the country from this guy, you have got to remind people of this every day. You can't use the excuse that you're tired of saying it. Constantly remind people that MAGA and Trump are not traditional conservatism, that these people have hijacked the conservative party, that there is no Republican Party in the way that it existed 20 years ago. That party is gone. And these people have stolen it because it's easier to steal a party than to build one of their own. And until the conservatives return to their law and order roots, moderate conservative voters, you've got to make the hard choice to support something else. And right now, like it or not, the Democratic Party is the pro-democracy, pro-law and order party in America. We have got to start correcting the flaws that made all of this possible and do everything that we can to excise this from our body politic and take fast action to prevent anything like this from happening again. For the good of the country. For the good of the country. Not party, not politics. For the good of the United States of America. And the continuation of this great experiment that has inspired the world since its creation. And ignoring the law and ignoring the Constitution are not conservative ideas. They are not conservatism. They do not represent traditional conservatism. Everybody knows this. Everybody knows this. It's time for us to stop protecting this criminal and admit that we made a huge mistake. And I think deep down, real conservatives are tired of defending the indefensible. We can get back to arguing about social issues and marginal tax rates later when the end of the republic is less of a threat. For now, support the law, support the Constitution, support the country. So about why we spend so much time talking about Donald Trump on this podcast that's supposed to be about Arkansas politics, I think there's an undeniable connection between Sarah and Trump. Sarah is exceptionally influenced by the MAGA base. I think the Republicans that voted for her, it's not necessarily about their love for Sarah. It's just that she was who was at the top of the Republican ballot that they got for the governor's race. I think I've talked to a lot of Republicans that, in spite of the fact that they voted for her, don't find her personally very appealing. The ones that do find her appealing always connect her back to Trump. And I think it's worth noting that Sarah from Mar-a-Lago's voters don't watch the Channel 4, 7, 11, or 16 news at 5 o'clock, they're still watching Fox News all day. The point is, Sarah probably isn't governor of Arkansas because of her own popularity. It's that she's a proxy for the national MAGA movement. And until that's taken care of, I think to talk about MAGA is to talk about Sarah. That's not to say that we'll ignore the terrible policy decisions that Sarah from Mar-a-Lago continues to make. It's just that I feel like it's all one topic. That until Sarah completely unhinges herself from the MAGA movement and Donald Trump, anything they do, it's fair game for us to connect her to it. And I think it's fair to mention at this point to anyone that voted for Sarah because of her connection to Donald Trump that she hasn't endorsed him for president yet. Just something to keep an eye on until it resolves itself. That's about all we have time for today. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Arkansas Moderati podcast, part of the Purple People Project family, where Sarah from Mar-a-Lago gets all of her information about the radical left. See you next time.